This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Good evening, everybody. It's Jay Scott. This is The Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. Welcome to another episode. Hope you're doing well out there. Hope you're staying healthy, getting ready to get out and about as we're hearing that more states are going to open up here pretty soon. I know here in Illinois, we're hearing that it's likely that June 1st, there's going to be some restrictions lifted. So I hope anyone who's dealing with this stuff is doing okay and keeping themselves busy. And hopefully listening to this podcast is helping you do that, because I know we've really increased our content since the beginning of April, where we're doing 5 episodes a week, up from 1 to 3 that we usually do. So hopefully you're enjoying it. I know I enjoy doing it, and I appreciate all the feedback you guys send me. My next guest, big fan of their podcast. The podcast is Metal Up Your Podcast. You can find them on metalupyourpodcast.com. You can find them on all podcast platforms. I'd like to welcome in from Nashville, Tennessee, the co-host, Clint Wells. What's going on, man? How you doing, Clint?
Hey, Jay. Doing great. Nice to be here, and thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the combo.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. I appreciate the time. We always start the podcast every time we have a new guest the same way with the same question, and that is the essence of our podcast, which is just like every rock song has a hook that sucks you in. Every rock fan has a moment, whether it's a song, an album, a band, or performance that hooked them on rock and roll. What was it for you?
Well, I don't want to sound pretentious, but for me, there's just so many. I was thinking about this today in anticipation of coming on the show, and when I think back, well, first of all, it feels like forever ago. I feel like, I'm 36, but I feel ancient at this point. There's so many things that come to mind, and I was born in 1983, and so MTV was in full swing by 1990. Between 7 and 13, MTV was still pretty bitchin'. So a lot of my hooks are sort of tied to MTV culture, and I think that's been a really important part of how I've progressed through my love of music. And for those of your listeners who don't know, I'm a professional musician in Nashville, a touring guitar player, session guitar player, and a songwriter. So I think about this all the time. So what MTV culture did for me is it allowed me to see something like Prince right next to something like Metallica, that would then be right next to Madonna, that would then be next to Tom Petty. And I just never grew up with any sort of tribal allegiance to any genre of music. It just all felt like one big awesome thing. So, the bands that were my first loves would easily be early 90s iterations of like Metallica. I don't really remember seeing the one video, which would have been 88, 89, but I sure as hell remember Enter Sandman. And so, but also Pearl Jam's first record, a lot of the grunge stuff in the early 90s, Facelift by Alice in Chains. And then when I was 13, I saw Kiss. Kiss was my first concert. They were on their reunion tour. And that's why I play guitar. No doubt about it. That's the reason I picked up the guitar. But it starts really with just whatever was on MTV in the late 80s and early 90s.
You mentioned MTV was huge for me too as well growing up. I'm about a decade older than you. I'm 45.
Mm-hmm.
And, I came along in the early 80s where the music was a lot more raw, and there was no frills to it. It was based, when you think of the bands like the new wave of British heavy metal movement, or you think of early Maiden, and you think of bands like Y&T and Overkill and stuff like that, or Raven even.
Mm-hmm.
There's like 3 periods of the 80s that I kind of grew up with. Like, you had the raw period, and then you had the beginning of the glam movement, and then towards the end it kind of became a parody of itself, like where bands were getting signed by what they looked like instead of what they sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
I remember going and reading the Circus magazines or the Hit Parader magazines, and knowing the bands because I would hear them on the local rock radio station in the early part of the 80s and the mid part of the 80s, but towards the end and in the early 90s, I was seeing pictures of bands. I'm like, I've never heard of these guys, but they had the look.
Right.
They had the look that was popular then. And then, the genre changed in like 93, 92, 94, that whole era right there. Mm-hmm. And Metallica was a big part of that change. Metallica, I've often said probably did more to quote unquote kill glam metal in the 80s than the grunge movement did.
Yeah, I think that Nirvana gets all the credit when really Metallica is a big pillar of that, but also I think Guns N' Roses destroyed that shit too. They maybe looked a little bit that way, like in the Welcome to the Jungle video, I guess, but musically, Appetite for Destruction is probably the first death knell of what seemed like schlocky 80s vapid hair metal that was just about getting laid. Guns N' Roses was the first album in a while that just felt super dangerous, but was also really mainstream. There was all sorts of underground stuff that felt really dangerous. But yeah, I agree. Metallica, I think, was a part of it too. And Metallica's one of the few bands that bridged both decades. A few bands kind of survived that. Aerosmith did, and then of course Guns kind of did. I mean, the Use Your Illusion records were huge, but yeah, it all changed. And of course, the grunge stuff, which kind of were the big heroes for slaying the hair metal dragon or whatever, that didn't last very long either. Those bands don't exist anymore, really, except for Pearl Jam. So it all kind of cycles through,
Yeah, I just, when I think of Metallica, and you mentioned, Guns N' Roses, which I think is an excellent point, but I still think Guns N' Roses really didn't move the needle away from, the glam movement. They were more popular, and, I think that they had that swagger similar to what Van Halen had in the late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think that undercurrent of, when Master of Puppets was released in 86, and then I remember when that video for One came out. I was in 8th grade when that video came out, and I remember the people that were wearing Poison shirts. The next week they were wearing Metallica shirts.
Right.
And I don't remember, I don't remember that change with Guns N' Roses. I think people liked Guns N' Roses, but they also liked Poison, and they liked all the other bands too that were around. But I think Metallica was just so in your face and so different that it really, it was a long coming change. It was a long time coming, and I think that started when the impact of Master of Puppets in 1986. Obviously, they had the albums before that too, but that was really when people really started to take notice of this underground movement that was happening. And I think it came to fruition with the And Justice for All and beyond.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you put it that way, that makes a lot of sense. But the danger of Night Train or Rocket Queen or Mr. Brownstone feels more in the same family of what maybe felt dangerous about Motley Crue or something, whereas Harvester of Sorrow and Blackened and One and Dyer's Eve does kind of feel like a whole different thing. And I think the reason you started seeing those shirts, was the credit really, it isn't that Metallica was making different music, which they were, but that's really MTV. That was the power of MTV because, I mean, I think the biggest tour they did on Puppets was opening for Ozzy. So they were still not as well known, What MTV did is just every kid that would be wearing a Poison shirt finally saw it, finally got to see Metallica. And that the video was perfect because it it completely subverted everything you expected in a video at that time. It was really long. It had all this dialogue from the film. It was black and white and dark and about a guy who had his fucking arms and legs blown off. And then some of the best, hookiest thrash progressive metal ever, you know? So it was a really kind of great storm. And then I think really set them up for what would happen with MTV and the Black Album a couple of years later, for sure, which just took the whole world, you know?
Yeah, and that's really what I kind of want to dive into today with Metallica, is that evolution. You know,
Right.
when you think of Kill 'Em All and you move forward to Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets into And Justice for All, there really wasn't anywhere left for them to go in terms of what they were currently doing, especially after And Justice. And Justice was such an angry record because of what happened with Cliff, obviously. And I think they were still in the mourning process when they did that album. And then they came out, they got Bob Rock to produce the Black Album. It completely changed, I wouldn't say completely changed, but it changed their sound, and it became more mainstream because it had a hook. It was more in that style where it pulled you in. Whereas the stuff previous to that, it was deep subjects, deep lyrics, you know, fast guitars, you know, different arrangements. And it wasn't for everybody, right? It wasn't, you know, it wasn't like everybody would enjoy something like that, because people are prone to know what they like or like what they like and continue to do that. And I think everybody was intrigued by Metallica prior to the Black Album. When those songs came out, like Enter Sandman, The Unforgiven, it gave the mainstream music fan, the music consumer, a reason to then grab onto Metallica because they were on MTV. Their videos were there. They were huge. They were on these huge tours. And it kind of gave those people the okay to say, hey, I can like Metallica because they sound like this now.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that goes into that. You know, getting Bob Rock, who was off the heels of, I guess, Dr. Feelgood, and they'd kind of wanted to move that way a little bit with Justice. They originally wanted Mike Klink to produce Justice, who had just done Appetite for Destruction. So I think they were already thinking about that a little bit in terms of sonics. But yeah, Bob Rock was the perfect guy for what they ended up doing. And I've seen a few interviews with the boys where they talk about really touring Justice was when they kind of saw how the long songs were just bumming everybody out in terms of, like, people were just getting tired, you know, physically from listening to 9-minute progressive metal songs, and that people just were beginning to look bored in the crowd. And that was like one of the pieces. Of course, also, it's hard to imagine them doing Injustice for All Part 2. Those songs are so great. They did it, you know? And Metallica's always been a band that really seems artistically driven to move on to something next, something more challenging or different. They've always really done that. You know, the level up from Kill 'Em All to Ride the Lightning is incredible to me in terms of songwriting. I love the songs on Kill 'Em All, and all these years later, when they play something like Hit the Lights Live or The Four Horsemen Live or Whiplash, and they play Seek and Destroy at almost every show, it's amazing to see how great those songs were, and it's really the first batch of little Bay Area thrash metal tunes they could just dream up, you know, and all these years later, those songs are still great. But the jump from anything on Kill 'Em All, in my opinion, to Fade to Black and For Whom the Bell Tolls and Creeping Death is just incredible. And then every record, they just started to level up. I feel like Puppets is similar to Lightning, but it's tighter and it sounds better. And then Justice is its own kind of little ecosystem, right? It's angry, it's political, it's long, it's thrash, but it's also progressive. Of course, the sonic issues with the album is there's a sort of sonic identity with the album. It doesn't have a lot of bass on it. And then the Black Album, to me, sort of looking back in hindsight, it just makes sense. Yeah, they went shorter songs, a more broad producer, bigger hooks. And then that, of course, gave way to the Load and Reload era, which is a divisive era in Metallica's canon. It's one of my favorites, probably because of my age at the time. But that ran into its logical conclusion, too. And then they tried something different with Saint Anger, and, you know, the story kind of goes on and on. But the Black Album is an interesting focal point because it's where a lot of people of a certain age really sort of came online with them. And it's really where a lot of people who were hip to them before got really bummed out. And people to this day, the disappointment that people felt with the Black Album reverberates today. I mean, we engage a lot of different kinds of Metallica fans with our podcast, and there are still people who just absolutely cannot stand the Bob Rock era, for sure.
That comes a lot, though, with a lot of artists, right? I think
yeah.
rock fans in general don't like it when their favorite artists evolve. They like their favorite artists to remain in the same box and not stray from what they know and what they like. And that's disappointing because I always like the evolution of the artist. I like when an artist goes out on a limb and does something different, and it may work, it may not, but that's the exciting part about listening to the music. And, you know, I just wrapped up these Metallica polls, or they're about to wrap up today, and you're right. You see the disdain for anything beyond And Justice for All by a lot of Metallica fans.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why you can't enjoy both. I don't know why you can't say, hey, you know, this is a different period. I mean, every band has evolved except for maybe AC/DC.
Right.
I mean, even Led Zeppelin, from Led Zeppelin 1 to In Through the Outdoor, is a completely different band. And as an artist, I don't know if fans appreciate the fact that an artist has to keep trying something new or else they get bored. Metallica couldn't make the same album again as Injustice for All. They couldn't keep doing it like you said.
Yeah, and it's just part of it. It's, you know, people were upset when the Beatles quit playing clubs in Germany. They were upset when Bob Dylan went quote unquote electric. I don't know. I try to empathize with it. Like, I try to get where they're coming from, because a really big part of who they are feels wrapped up in a particular era of a certain band. And then there's a feeling of, it's very dramatic, but a feeling of betrayal when they evolve or change or whatever, take their makeup off or wear leather pants. Who knows what it is? It's something for any band. But I think one of the ways I escaped that is because of MTV. Like I was trying to say before, is like, I just never had any place to put that. Like, oh, this is my tribe. They look and act like this always. And if they don't do this, then I'm off the team or something. Like when Saint Anger came out for me, I did not understand that record at all. I listened to it once or twice, and then I took it out, and I don't think I revisited it for over 10 years, till the podcast. And in a lot of ways, it felt like wherever they were going, I couldn't go with them. But that's as dramatic as it got for me. Yeah, I don't remember being tempted to like burn the rest of their albums or talk shit or go on message boards and get angry. I just got off the ride for a minute, you know? And we have, to be fair, we have had a lot of listeners that have talked about either via the virtues of the podcast, pontificating about Load and Reload or the Black Album. People have come around and given it another shot and really enjoyed it. And then there are people who are just, it's not for them, but they're not the sort of purist, like first 4 thrash albums only. But I think other than AC/DC, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think about that all the time. That's like the only band that still kind of makes the same record over and over, but it's so good, it's just undeniable. Any other band that's interesting to me, Van Halen, Kiss, all of this, the Beatles, Dylan, Zappa, Led Zeppelin, you mentioned, of course, Metallica, U2. These are all bands that evolved and changed. And I can't imagine being as interested, you know? Like, I get the Slayer itch occasionally, like most people who love metal do. But I don't know. Slayer gets old to me, because and to their credit, I mean, they just really stayed in that lane, and in a lot of ways, they're untouchable in that speed metal, you know, demonic lyric thing. But I don't know. I guess I'm not really interested in credibility and what people arbitrarily decide is credible in music. My favorite bands are the biggest bands in the world, which is why we do a Metallica podcast, you know. And if you're going to be the biggest band in the world, you're going to have people that are going to get upset with your artistic decisions. I guess that's just built in.
Do you think they would have made the Black Album with the way it sounded had Cliff been living?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And we actually had Cliff's dad, Ray Burton, on before he passed away. He came on the show, and we became friendly with him. And that was something that we talked to Ray about. Ray seems to think that Cliff would have had a problem with it. Not any kind of, you know, they were all brothers. They were all tired. And of course they all looked up to Cliff. So he thinks that Cliff definitely would have been an influence, maybe away from, maybe more the image side of it too, more into Load and Reload, the cutting the hair and wearing the, you know, like the Cuban mafia suits and guy liner. But I've always thought that Cliff would have actually been kind of down for it, because Cliff was the one who was playing Lynyrd Skynyrd on the bus. And Cliff was the one introducing the band to Yes and to atypical hard rock stuff. He's the one who introduced the band to the Misfits, and so Cliff was interested in different kinds of music. And another aspect of it that I think is really fascinating is Cliff wasn't really that involved with the making of their albums. He was definitely one of the primary songwriters, but there are all sorts of stories about like he would just one of the records. It's either Lightning or Puppets, where they're all getting on the plane to go to Copenhagen. He missed the flight. Like he didn't even show up, and they finally got a hold of him. He's like, "Yeah, the first week is just you guys arguing about drums, so I figure I'll just come later." And then the stories of him being in the studio, he just goes in, knocks his stuff out, and then leaves. And so I think about that too. I'm like, well, it's just easy to sort of imagine that Cliff would have been really upset about it because he had this really great, like, he was just very pure, like very honest and pure and had a lot of strong opinions and was a guy they looked up to. But at the same time, though, he might have been cool with it because, it got broad and it got melodic. I think the hooks got as strong as anything. I mean, the hook to Sabbath True is as strong as anything they've ever done. Bob Rock famously called it the Kashmir of the 90s, which I think is pretty spot on. And as much as you've heard Enter Sandman or think it's weak or slow or something, I mean, if you really try to, as an experiment, listen to it with fresh ears, like imagine that you've never heard it before, it's super heavy and dark and awesome. And those are all things that Cliff liked, And I'm thinking about Cliff co-wrote Fade to Black. Cliff co-wrote Orion. He wrote Orion, which has a lot of slow melodic parts. Think about the slow part to the song Master of Puppets. Think about the song The Thing That Should Not Be, which could have been on the Black Album, in my opinion. So those are my opinions about that. I could be wrong. He's not here to defend himself or to weigh in on it, but it is interesting to think about the force he would have had on the band, sonically or otherwise, had he lived.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because everybody looks at Cliff as when they were doing Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning, he was like the larger than life guy. I mean, there are fans that will only vote for a Cliff song over anything else. It doesn't matter what album it's on, it's always got to be Cliff. So he really had like a really dedicated fan base within Metallica. Mm-hmm. And it's just interesting to think about what would have happened had he remained in the band and didn't have the horrible accident, or they didn't have the horrible accident they had, and what they would have been like and how they would have evolved. Would have been a slower evolution? Would have been the same? Those are questions that I often think about. Like you said, he's not here to answer that, and that's unfortunate. But I'd like to think that James and Lars also have obviously have a huge influence on the band now, and I think they really wanted to go in that direction because I think they didn't, like you said, they were getting tired of playing these long songs, and looking at the crowd and seeing them being exhausted and being bummed out. So I think it would have happened. I just don't know at the speed or how many albums it would have taken. And then if it would have gone slower, who knows? They may have missed their window of becoming, this larger than life band, this huge stadium touring band that the Black Album gave them the opportunity to be.
Yeah. I think he would have had more impact on the Load and Reload era more than the Black Album. I think I can see Cliff defending Enter Sandman and saying it's fucking awesome, especially because it was Kirk's riff and him and Kirk were tight. And I think he might have had a problem with some of the more bloated double album silly stuff that's on Load and Reload. But because people forget too that the Black Album has a couple of songs on the Black Album that could have been on Injustice for All easily. I think Holier Than Thou could have been on Injustice for All easily. So could The Struggle Within. Through the Never sounds like Puppets. It's kind of like Master Puppets Part 2 with this kind of spider riff at the top. It's like Sandman, Nothing Else Matters, Unforgiven. Those songs that kind of bummed people out in that way, that they weren't speed metal or whatever. But the Black Album actually, I mean, there's some pretty great thrashy stuff on the Black Album. I think it's really Load and Reload. So the Black Album happened, and I think fans were like, uh-oh, oh no, oh crap. And then the people who were butthurt about that had no idea what was coming, because if they're upset about Holier Than Thou, then they're really not going to like Fuel, or The Memory Remains.
Yeah, I remember when Load and Reload came out. I always liked the deeper cuts, like Devil's Dance. I always had a connection with those songs more so than the ones that were the hits. But I also remember too with the Black Album, like you said, I never thought when I first heard it. I was a junior in high school when that album came out, sophomore or junior, and I didn't think it was like light Metallica. I thought it was heavy too. I thought when I heard Enter Sandman, it was just as heavy as the other material prior to that. Sad But True was just an amazing song. Wherever I May Roam, all that stuff. When you first heard it back then and you're 16, 17 years old, I didn't really, yes, the songs were shorter and they had the hooks that maybe the other albums didn't, but I just felt that it was great. It was another Metallica masterpiece, and I didn't understand the problem that people had until you started to talk to those hardcore fans who, when you mention Nothing Else Matters, it's almost like they pass out. They get anxiety, but it's just a shame because here they are as artists trying to do something different, trying to evolve, bringing in a new producer, trying to do something different, because I don't think Metallica would have lasted if the Black Album didn't happen.
Yeah, it's definitely the commercial peak of their entire career. I guess you could argue that the peak rode into Load and Reload, but they toured it for like 3 years, a bunch of big singles, and it's a defining moment not only in their career but like in all of metal. And I think that Enter Sandman, other than like Iron Man or Back in Black, like songs like that, I think Enter Sandman is probably the most recognizable heavy metal song of all time. Like, so the accomplishments of that era are just undeniable. And you can want to shove Metallica back into a club with Raven on the Kill 'Em All for One tour, playing Whiplash. You can try to keep them there if you want, and that's fine. But the band has other plans, obviously. And there are people who are so hardcore about the underground thrash sensibility of Metallica's early stuff that they got off the ride with Fade to Black, and Metallica basically starts in 82, and then you got people getting off the ride in early 84. So to those people, obviously listen to whatever you want and you can have any opinion you want about music, but those people, I think, are just leaving so much great music on the table. And it's funny that you mentioned what you did about, like, to you, the Black Album was just another good Metallica album. So for me, I think the first thing I ever heard of them would have been Enter Sandman. So in a lot of ways, I'm almost disqualified from this conversation because I'm just so locked into the context of how I came online with the band. But I became a huge fan. And then, so my first album that came out as a Metallica fan would have been Load. So I had to wait like 4 or 5 years for that. But you better believe that once I got the Black Album, I got Binge and Purge, and then I went back and then was a huge fan of everything. And I don't ever remember, other than being like, oh yeah, Kill 'Em All doesn't sound as good. I could just recognize as a kid that the recording was shittier. But I just don't remember drawing any kind of lines in the sand of, like, I had to read all this in criticism, that, this record's not thrash. And I didn't know what producers did or that I didn't know who Fleming Rasmussen was. I knew who Bob Rock was because I was reading the liner notes of the Black Album. But to me, it just really sounded like another album by a band I like. And I mentioned that on our podcast recently, and the feedback to that was pretty interesting because about half the people who responded to that comment extremely vehemently disagree with me. They're like, how can you not notice a difference between Disposable Heroes and The Unforgiven, for example, right? And then half the people were like, no, I totally get it. And even people who were like OG, maybe they saw the Ozzy tour, and so they followed the band from 84, 85, 86, all the way to Black Album. And they were like, yeah, to me, it just sounded like the progression of Metallica. So it's hard to parse that out, and it's kind of different for everybody, but it is a thing to behold, the divisiveness of that album. And I wonder a lot about Metallica's feelings about it, especially now. It doesn't seem like they were too bothered by it, because for every fan they lost, they must have gained hundreds and hundreds and hundreds on those tours, especially that Guns tour.
I also think there's a little bit of machismo, with the oh, I'm only gonna like these 4 albums, Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All, but I got my secret, Black Album and Load and Reload in my house that no one will know that I have, but I enjoy the music. But to my fellow Metallica fans, I gotta say I can't like it. So I think there's a lot of that too as well. It's just like when people, say that they don't like or they hate Bon Jovi. I wonder how many people who say they hate Bon Jovi actually have Bon Jovi's music in their collection
or
somewhere.
Their girlfriends do, and then when their girlfriends play it, they're like, oh, that's pretty good,
Yeah, exactly.
I remember, diving way into the Puppets era, and James at one of the big festivals they played famously had Kill Bon Jovi on his on his headstock, because I guess Bon Jovi's helicopter flew down while they were doing their set. And yeah, I guess I was too young, and again just a kid of MTV. So if Living on a Prayer came on MTV, I was fucking loving it, bro. I loved Bon Jovi, and I still love and respect Bon Jovi, especially as songwriters, and all that great Desmond Child stuff that he did. And but I remember seeing that and being like, yeah, I guess there was a time when it was like really uncool to like some of that stuff. Like was it uncool to like Whitesnake? I don't even know. Was it uncool to like 80s Kiss? I mean, it's been kind of uncool to be a Kiss fan the whole time through. I feel like my whole life as a Kiss diehard, I'm just defending them. But all that stuff of being on a team and not being, you can't like this because you're over here. I just thankfully kind of escaped that way of looking at music.
Yeah, I did too. I like to look at each album as its own, right? It's not connected to the previous one, and it's not, what's going to happen in the future. I like to walk in and absorb an album with my ears, my mind, and just absorb it and just take it in as I listen to it.
Did you grow up in Chicago?
Yeah, I did.
So what was the vibe? Like, I mean, you would have been a teenager. So what, like, the hard rock scene, the perceptions of in the late 80s, early 90s, were people listening to Motley Crue? Was Motley Crue cool? What was going on in Chicago at that time?
Oh, yeah. I grew up in a neighborhood with a bunch of kids my age to my older brother's age. So the younger kids always had the music that was filtered from their older brothers. So,
right.
I remember, being home from school one day while my brother was at school and going in and sneaking in to listen to Van Halen 1. I was like 7 years old. And I remember one of my neighbors making my brother a mixtape with 2 Judas Priest songs. And I remember hearing a kid, probably 3 years older than me, bringing his boombox to the park down the street while we were all there playing wiffle ball or whatever, and hearing the song Bastard by Shout at the Devil by Motley Crue. It was just... So it was a huge thing. I mean, it was, Chicago had its scene. Every town or every city had their own scene, and a vibrant scene where cover bands really didn't exist back then. So you could draw a full house at a club with bands playing original music, just local to Chicago. And that was something that I was a little too young to experience, but I was aware of it. And I knew of all the local Chicago bands, whether there was a band called Hammer On, and there was a band called Odette, and all these band called Sergeant Rocks, and all these bands that were in existence back then. It certainly wasn't as big as the Sunset Strip scene, which was just completely crazy, but it was. Yeah, all that stuff was cool. I mean, I was the one. I went to a Catholic school, so I was the one wearing a Motley Crue shirt underneath my uniform shirt. Getting get detentions from the nuns. I had this Motley Crue shirt with a skull with handcuffs going through the eyes.
Right.
And you could see the outline of the artwork underneath my blue shirt, my powder blue shirt. And I'd get called down to the principal's office. She'd rip my shirt off. And,
love it.
It was
knowing that
great.
Knowing that you had a pentagram on you somewhere that they might not be able to see.
Well, yeah, and then that was the whole thing too. Like, all our folders were all like with the we would draw Iron Maiden and Van Halen and Kiss. I mean, the first album I bought was in 1984. I was 9. The first album I bought with my own money was Kiss Lick It Up. So yeah, it was pretty vibrant, and you couldn't get away with it. And then when you saw the U.S. festival on TV, when in 1983 I was 8. and you saw Van Halen and Scorpions and Ozzy and Triumph and Priest and Quiet Riot, it was like, wow, this is, and you saw the sea of people. I mean, there had to be at least 150,000 people at this show. And it was just, the greatest line ever on stage is David Lee Roth during the opening of Romeo Delight, after the backstory of them headlining the U.S. festival was they went on late because they were all wasted. They had to sober up. And, the first song is Romeo Delight, and David Lee Roth in the middle of the song goes, I forgot the fucking words. And it's like, you're like 8 years old, and you're like, dude, that's awesome. It's like, it was just a great moment to experience that and to, be 8 years old and, and nothing else. I mean, there was no video games. I mean, there was Atari, but that was really primitive. And there was 7 channels on your TV before you got cable and able to watch it. So yeah, it was pretty cool back then. And, I became a student of the music because I loved it so much. Like I would just, engross myself in liner notes and absorbing music and listening to it and, listening to the hard rock metal station till 1 a.m. when I was like 11 and going to school the next day completely like tired and not being able to function. And I don't know how I got through it, but it just became a huge passion. I just loved everything about it.
Yeah, I try to remember that because I think that's where it comes from. I think it's a little misplaced. I think to take that, because what it is the fusing of your identity with music, with the music, which I have. I mean, dude, my music is the greatest love of my life, and I have a family now and a wife and a daughter who obviously are the most important things to me, but in some ways it's such a different thing that by decades predates me even knowing them. So it's this thing that's just been with me. It was my doorway to other worlds. It was my escape from what was tough about parts of my childhood. And it's a magical landscape that's completely totemic and eternal for me. So I get all that. I just think it gets a little misplaced when you make it about being on a team or being right. And I was, I've gotten really grumpy about this on my podcast. But dude, if we get anything wrong about Metallica on our show, you better believe we're going to hear about it. Like to the minute detail of James didn't use that kind of guitar pick in 1986 or whatever it is, and I get so annoyed with that. But I understand too that, like me, a lot of our listeners, these records were like their best friends. And so all they did was listen to these albums and look at the liner notes, and every Hit Parader magazine or anything that you could get your hands on back then that had any information or pictures about your favorite band, you were just going to consume it, So for us to get what seems like a flippant detail wrong about whatever the fuck in Master of Puppets, that means a lot to people, So I think about that kind of stuff all the time. Just that really intense connection to this music that we love and how it plays itself out, especially as we all get older. I think about that often.
Yeah, I see the same thing when I do the polls with bands. I line up songs in these brackets, and some people take this very serious. It's very intricate to them, and I love that. On one hand, like I really love and appreciate someone's passion for a band, music that's connected with them. But on the other side too, what does it become? Does it lose the fun in that music is supposed to represent and connect with? Sometimes I think there needs to be that balance where yes, you could be that serious about it and that interested about it, but at the same time, you don't want it to become like this study of music. You want it to enjoy the way the music was intended, which is, even though Metallica's lyrics or a band like Rush's lyrics are a lot deeper than a lot of other bands, it's still supposed to be a good time. It's still supposed to, take you to another place. And I think sometimes when you get that serious, it hinders you from doing that.
Well, I've noticed this, that it's sort of a need to display how big a fan you are in terms of trying to get everything right, because there's a strange competition amongst some fans of like, I know more than you. And I just haven't felt that. I mean, maybe I felt that when I was in high school, because that's when you should be feeling immature feelings like that. And it's just been so long since I wanted to compete with anybody about how much information I know about James Hetfield. But I agree. We used to say at the beginning of our show that we know more than you, we know less than you, and so the idea of the podcast was really just to celebrate the music and not. I mean, we do a lot of research, dude, and we really do care about getting the stuff right because, we're creating a body of work that will hopefully be interesting to Metallica fans for a long time, even after we're done. So we try to get it right. But when just being an encyclopedia about the band is more important than having fun and like getting connected with why we love this shit to begin with, then if we move away from that, I just begin to get less interested in what's interesting about the show. And I'm sure that, your whole premise is finding out what got people interested and hooked, and moving away from that into a trivia battle, it doesn't interest me.
Yeah, I like the discussions that arise from it.
Me too, yeah.
And where the conversation goes, and I always appreciate that. But like I said, sometimes I believe that it takes the fun out of everything, I know there's people that are very passionate, like I said, and it just becomes like, hey man, this is just a poll. This is just a Twitter poll. It's not meant to, because there's people that will attack other people on my Twitter feed because of how they voted or, a song that they like, like it's hard to imagine, oh my God, how can someone like a song off a Load, and it's like, well, maybe that's the first time they heard the band, or maybe that's how they were introduced to the band. So there's always that connection with them. And I just wish people would just respect that. I mean, music has the ability to connect with people in various ways, and there's no opinion that's wrong. There's never opinion about music that's wrong, but you also have to understand and appreciate where someone else's perspective is coming from.
Absolutely.
I grew up in my era, you grew up in your era, and I always like that conversation. I like that conversation where I'm learning about you and where your tastes are and what your perspective is and what connects with you musically, where, I'm from a different generation, so I connect with things a lot different. Like my son, who's 15, I have the physical connection to music, albums and touching and feeling and that physical connection to it, whereas he doesn't. So it's a totally different way of listening. And that happens, my first album was Kiss, and moving on to other albums. And I'm kind of like you. I like a wide variety of stuff. I like everything from, Metallica, Led Zeppelin, Kiss, all the way to, Butch Walker, Pete Yorn, artists like that, Lucero, stuff like that. So my tastes are very wide in range, and I don't have an issue with that. I know there's some people that do, and that's unfortunate.
It's funny you mentioned Butch and Pete Yorn, two artists I absolutely love. Pete Yorn's album, The Day I Forgot, which I think is his second album, is probably in my top 20 of all time. I know every second of that record. And then Butch Walker's album, Afraid of Ghosts, the year that record came out, it was all I was listening to. So I'm in the same boat, and I can't really imagine feeling differently. And I also don't judge or begrudge anybody who they stay in this one lane. Like sometimes, because we do a Metallica podcast, and my co-host Ethan was in a metal band called Demon Hunter, and our metal pedigree is okay, but I think because we do the podcast, people assume that we're just like metal freaks, which we are definitely not. So, we'll have people who are like, "Can you guys do an episode on like the history of like Norwegian black metal?" And I'm like, "I don't know shit about that, bro. My favorite metal band is Metallica, dude." Or like, can you guys give us your thoughts on the sonic evolution of Celtic Frost? And I'm like, I can't, because I don't know it, If it's Pantera or Tool or Metallica, the biggest bands of the genre, then no problemo. But I'm more versed in Radiohead than I am in the new wave of British heavy metal.
Yeah, I dove into the new wave of British heavy metal. I was a fan of a few bands growing up in the early 80s, of course, Maiden, Saxon, and trying to think of some like Tank, bands like that. And then I really revisited. I went down this rabbit hole for like 6 months in like 4 years ago, and I must have spent a fortune on these rare new wave of British heavy metal band albums. And it was like, I finally had to stop. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I don't need this rare, Savage album or this rare, Tank album, and I love this stuff, it's great. I do enjoy it.
How much of that do you think is nostalgia? Like, not to take away from the music or how it's hitting you now, or because it's also interesting to think about how it's hitting you now with everything you've been through since then. But how much of that was getting you in touch with when you were a kid? Because I have this theory, my friend Bob Schneider and I talk about this all the time, that like the music that happens to you from like 9 to like 14 is just it gets encapsulated in this sacred little bubble that that nothing can ever tamper with, and it becomes this portal or something. Was that similar to you, like kind of getting back into something that you loved when you were a kid, and your adult way of expressing it now is to just get like rare vinyl that you couldn't get when you were a kid?
Right. Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it, because when you think back of that new wave of British heavy metal era, the album covers were so like,
so fun, right?
Yeah, it was like you're walking around with a piece of art, like on the album cover.
Yeah.
So that was always intriguing. When you talk about Seek and Destroy with the sonically and how it was produced, where it's not the best production, it's very reminiscent of what the new wave of British heavy metal was. A lot of that stuff,
absolutely.
a lot of that stuff that was recorded was very primitive and very underproduced. I mean, I think, some of the albums I love the music, but it's difficult to listen to because it's like, man, I'm like, they didn't know what the hell they were doing back then, or maybe they just didn't have the equipment to do it, but
right.
It just really doesn't capture the essence. I mean, there's some bands, like I said, Saxon, Maiden, of course, and Diamond Head, and there's another band called Quartz that always had good production, but, here I am mentioning Quartz on a podcast. But it's just, I like that. I appreciate that music because it's the first movement that was directly influenced by the Sabbaths and the Deep Purples in the UK that produced that movement. You can even probably include Priest in, with influencing the new wave of British heavy metal. But it was like that first group of bands that had a direct, or the influence had a direct influence on what they played.
Absolutely.
So,
you can kind of put them in a family, and you can draw lines, and smarter people than me have pontificated about what thrash is, and I've always thought it was this really great collision of all of that new wave stuff, which I love that stuff. I love Maiden, that first Def Leppard record, and any of the stuff I hear from that, I love it. But it's only in terms of what I hear, how it influenced Metallica. But that sort of Southern California, the collision of that new wave of British heavy metal with punk rock, with those bands that they were getting into, like Budgie and the Misfits and stuff, that's kind of what I think of as the stew that created thrash. And then I feel like Metallica kind of out of the gate invented it and perfected it, which I know people will disagree with that and say Testament or Exodus or Megadeth or whatever, but almost as soon as they invented it, they're moving forward. To kind of echo back to a little bit of the previous conversation, it's like they invented it, they perfected it, they made like the seminal thrash songs and albums, and then they started to move on and evolve it. And I think that's why I still listen to it all these years later. Like, that's why I still listen to their new album, which their last album is some of the best sounding and written songs that they've done in a long time.
Yeah, I agree. I took my son to that tour when they played Soldier Field, and I thought it was just an amazing, amazing show, and I love the album.
Yeah.
I like that they're making new music that's still, in my opinion, relevant, and still, and they're playing it live, right? Like a lot of bands, they put out the record and then maybe play one song. I mean, they were playing 4 or 5 songs from that album when I saw them live.
Yeah, it was a legitimate record cycle. It wasn't like, well, here's just an excuse to tour and play the Black Album hits again and sell out stadiums. It was as legitimate as if they put it out 15 years ago, when I guess maybe someone would have argued they were more relevant. But I think they proved in this last cycle that they're still viable as a real band. Kiss putting out Monster and Sonic Boom, they would play one song from those albums, and then it was just another excuse to play Love Gun again. And I understand that. It's hard to compete. Think about a band like Kiss that's having to compete with all those great classic albums they made. And even a band like Van Halen's going to have to do that. any band that's as old as these bands we're talking about, Metallica is basically always competing with Creeping Death, and which is one of the greatest metal songs, as far as I'm concerned, ever conceived. So the fact that they stepped up to the plate and delivered something like Moth into Flame or Spit Out the Bone that can sit next to Creeping Death in a set list or in a catalog, and it makes sense. It's not some sort of consolation like, oh, the mid-50s old rockers, they gave it a nice go, and it's not like that at all. It's as good as anything. So how did your 15-year-old son, what did he think about the gig?
Oh, he loved it. He just totally enjoyed it. A week before that, I took him to see Iron Maiden. And so he kind of had like the 1-2 punch, and he just, he's been a fan ever since. And he's actually the one that wanted to go. I mean, because he heard Metallica first with the Hardwired album, Hardwired to Self-Destruct. So he was, listening to that, Moth to a Flame, Atlas Rise, all that stuff. So he's God, how old was he when we went to that? That was, he was 12. And, wow. And he, this is what he was listening to, when he heard Maiden first, it was Book of Souls.
That's the album tour,
yeah. So, that's what when people criticize others for liking a period of music that maybe they're not as fond of, they don't realize that when that person came in, usually is always going to be their favorite era, because that's what first brought them into that, to that band, that connected them to that band. So, yeah, he's waiting for another album. He's like, when's Metallica going to tour again? And I'm like, I don't know. Usually, obviously now with everything going on, everything's been delayed. But, but the other thing too is how many more albums does Metallica really have to give? I mean, they're getting older. They're very physical on stage. I mean, I know they're starting to have health problems, and as they get older, obviously that's normal. But maybe, definitely one album, maybe it's two, but you think about their tour cycles, it's going to be difficult to put two albums out, because they usually do an album every 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, this last one, it was 8 years, which is so long. And they work, especially the last decade or so, they work slow. And to get an album as good as we got, for them, it just takes time. And so, yeah, in terms of what's coming up with them, I think on the one hand, everything you're saying makes sense, and it takes a long time, and maybe 1 or 2, I guess, and then they got to tour it, and it's got to make sense for how the machine of Metallica works. On the other hand, I think legitimately they were surprised at how well received the album was. I don't think they thought people cared as much outside of their big hits. So the fact that the album resonated with their fan base, and that like everyone was really hungry to hear the deep cuts and wanted to really treat the record normally, was a surprise to them. And I think it got them really excited about being more creative, because they're just like any other artist, a little insecure, especially as they age through the process. And rock and roll traditionally is a young man's game, and they're competing with the Slipknots and the Ghosts and whomever else. And I think that like any artist, that can kind of get to them, and they start to doubt themselves. But Hardwired, I got to imagine for them was a huge vindication is not the right word, just a huge encouragement that people still want to hear new stuff. Because, I'm not dying to hear a new Kiss record, and I love those dudes. And I actually loved their last album, Monster, and I wish they would have played more of it live, but I'm not really dying for a new Kiss album. I liked the new Maiden stuff. I saw that same tour that it sounds like you guys saw, where Ghost opened. Was that the one you saw?
Yeah, that was great.
That show blew my mind, dude. I thought that show was so incredible. I can't imagine being 12 and seeing that in the same year as the Metallica tour, like the stadium tour with the big screens. That's the kind of stuff that when you're 12, you never forget. That's like important. Those are important moments in a 12-year-old's life.
Yeah, he's been to so many shows with me, the Metallica, Maiden stuff. His first show was, I took him to see Butch Walker in Kentucky when he was 5. And he really enjoyed himself at that. And then we've just been going to shows. I mean, he's gone to Winery Dogs with me. Who else has he gone? Judas Priest. He's seen Johnny Lang. So I try to expose him to a different, variety of stuff. It's mostly rock-based. I think he really enjoyed Johnny Lang, which really surprised me, just being the blues player. I remember seeing Johnny Lang when he was like 18 years old open up for Aerosmith back in the day. So he's got a great ear for a young kid, and he likes what he likes. What's really cool too is he keeps me up to date on the new rock bands. You know, like he's always like, oh, check these guys out. These guys are really good. Check out the Amazons or check out Goodbye June. And yeah, it's nice to kind of have that. And of course, you know, with the movie The Dirt coming out, the Motley Crue movie, you know, the movie that he wasn't supposed to see, but I come to find out that him and all his friends have seen it multiple times,
right.
has just injected more energy into the rock movement, I think, you know, with now young kids have experienced and seen what Motley Crue was about. And that's another thing, too, that I've touched on is just the lack of rock star right now in rock and roll, you know, that do connect with kids, that kids don't want to take their eyes off. You know, when a movie, The Dirt, which is about a band and their heyday 30 years ago, can resonate and connect with kids that are in high school now, and kids want more, and now kids want to go see them in concert, that's a sign that rock and roll needs to stop playing it down the middle of the road and start being rock stars again, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the closest thing you have to a rock star right now is someone like Post Malone, who sort of stylistically and aesthetically embodies what's dangerous about that kind of thing. I mean, other than him, which I'm a huge Post Malone fan, I don't know where you sit on that, but I think, you know, it's definitely not hard rock music, but in terms of like the rock star persona, he embodies that more than anyone. But it would be like, I don't know, it'd be like Jack White and the guy from Queens of the Stone Age. But it's hard to even think of it. Like maybe Corey Taylor. But
I do think
the
guy from the Struts, Luke Spiller, has the ability to be that person, because I've seen the Struts live and they're incredible, and that guy has the crowd in the palm of his hand. And I think there's a couple others that can grow into it, but yeah, I agree with you on Post Malone. I'm not a fan of his music, but I am aware that hip hop embraces controversy. They embrace that rock and roll image that for whatever reason rock and roll doesn't want to, do anymore. I don't know why or when that happened. I've always said that if a PR person is telling you what not to say, you have the wrong PR person. The PR person should be telling you, okay, you said that, well, now we have to deal with it. Now we have to, respond to it.
Right.
But, I just.
Axl Rose was like, hey, by the way, I jumped into the crowd last night and beat up a photographer, and then I ended the show an hour and a half early. Sorry. That's what you guys have to deal with this week, Or sorry, I went on a 15-minute rant in Japan about Warren Beatty. So sorry, you guys have to deal with that now.
Yeah, but that's what I'm talking about. It's like, if people react to you, that's a good thing. If parents are telling their kids to turn it off when you're on the TV, that's good. That's a good thing. You shouldn't run away from that. That means kids want to listen to you. I know when my parents, I had to sneak Bark at the Moon into my house. I had to hide my Maiden records when I was a kid, but it made me want to listen to it more, made me like them more, because there was that sense of danger. And that's what I see with people like Post Malone and other artists in that genre that maybe I'm not a fan of, but I connect with what the image with the image that they're trying to portray. I totally get it.
Yeah, for me it was hiding Facelift and hiding a Danzig album, and I also was hiding Dr. Dre's The Chronic from my mom. Those were the ones that I was like, if my mom finds this shit, she's gonna throw this away. And I remember my mom found my Facelift CD, and this is actually one of the coolest things my mom ever did. She didn't freak out, she didn't throw it away, but she sat down and listened to it with me and read the lyrics with me. And because the big song was "Man in the Box," which has some sort of anti-religious big sentiments in the chorus, and but she read the whole thing and kind of took the whole thing in. And if you do that, you'll see that Alice in Chains are harmless, and it's just rock and roll made by guys in their early 20s, and it's mostly kind of dumb and fun. So I think about that all the time, that when my worst nightmare was her finding some of these albums, and then she found it and she just read it with me and was like, all right, cool. She checked it out, and then she split and let me have it, So, and I actually listen to a lot of Post Malone, and his stuff's fine. I get why kids love it. There's nothing that risque about it. And, he was a kid who loved hard rock. He's a huge Metallica fan and covers Metallica songs, and He recently did a like a COVID benefit where him and Travis Barker and a couple other musicians performed like 20 deep cut Nirvana songs to raise money. They raised like $2 million. And he played electric guitar and he sang like Kurt Cobain. It was awesome. It rocked, you know. The modern sort of hip hop stars taking on the rock star persona. They're more eclectic, I think, than maybe some of the genre stars of the last 15 or 20 years, which I think is a really cool thing about music and good for someone like your son to see or my daughter to see.
Yeah, no, I agree. You know, I think, though, that hip-hop and artists like Post Malone realized that there was a vacuum, realized that there was a want of the current generation to have that rock star. And if rock and roll is not going to take it, they're not going to, you know, continue on with doing what they're supposed to do and carrying the rock and roll flag, someone else is taking it. And that right now is hip-hop. That's right, you know, artists like Post Malone. I mean, I think it really even started with Eminem. You know, when you go back, you know, with you know the controversies that surrounded him, and maybe you could even peel back the orange and go back to Snoop Dogg. But you know, when you saw like the early 2000s, where really there was a lack of direction with rock music, and there was a lot of cookie cutter stuff. Not all of it was cookie cutter, but there was a lot of it. I just think that they're filling the void. And when you look at the article in Forbes magazine about Motley Crue's demographics that are now buying their merchandise and streaming their music. Before the movie, it was 35 and older, which was the majority. Now, it's 35 and under that is listening to their music and buying their merchandise. So, say what you want about...
Who's another band that you would like to see a movie like The Dirt made about? That had the... Because I watched it. I thought it was a lot of fun. I read the book, too. But sort of a Netflix, straight to streaming, but it had a budget. It looks good. What are the couple of bands that you would like to see that?
Well, I'll answer that in two parts. If I'm looking for big screen, Martin Scorsese directed, that's totally authentic, I'd love to see the story of Led Zeppelin. Okay, so that's would be my like big screen. I'm gonna go see that movie at midnight the night before, and go check it out. And now if I'm going to straight to stream, and it's a band that you know has a budget similar to The Dirt, I would say Guns N' Roses.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, just
another Mick Wall book that they could adapt, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about all the stuff going on with them in the '80s, and you know, with Tracy Guns and Axl Rose, and that breakup and how all that started, and you know, all the tension between Slash and Axl. Getting back to The Dirt really quick, I've often thought that should have been a miniseries because there was so much stuff that they didn't even talk about.
You know, that really would have worked as sort of an episodic, like a 10-episode, hour-long journey through their stuff. Yeah, and maybe the success of that film will inspire that, and the success of the Freddie Mercury film, which I thought was excellent, Bohemian Rhapsody. I haven't seen the Elton John film yet, but I've heard it's also excellent. So maybe we're kind of slipping into a cool era where there are budgets for that, and there's a lot of interest in that. I think another thing that really got this is kind of old now, but it still keeps the fire of rock and roll alive for kids, is Guitar Hero.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, kids are hearing, bands that I don't think they ever would have heard of. Like, you know, my wife knows some of these hard rock songs from playing Guitar Hero that she never would have heard of. So that gives me hope, too, that people are still interested in guitar-based music, which I don't want to do a get off my lawn thing. I love Post Malone. I listen to Post Malone and Drake all the time. But I do worry about guitar-based hard rock music having a seat at the table culturally in music, because there's something just so kinetic and animating about that, especially for kids, and the danger of it, the rebelliousness of it, that I think is culturally really important, and I hope we don't lose that.
Yeah, I've often thought about that too with the Guitar Hero, you know, whether it's Eddie Van Halen or Randy Rhoads or Satriani. I mean, I had Satriani on a couple weeks ago, and you know, his music today is just as good as it was when I was growing up. And it's a shame that there's really not an outlet right now for that type of music. You know, I mean, even the new rock stuff that's coming out, I like a lot of the new stuff. And I may upset some people, but I like Greta Van Fleet. I've seen them 3 times live, and they're incredible. I think they need to work on their stage presence. and I think they should be allowed to evolve their sound, or evolve as musicians and maybe get away from the Led Zeppelin comparisons. But I don't have a problem with young kids listening to blues-based rock that features the guitar. So,
Right.
I do think, though, that there isn't that guy that's on guitar right now that there are, but I'm talking about with new bands that just wails. It just like you got to hear it,
Right. I think that an unlikely guitar hero. I mean, I would have I would have found this opinion really distasteful about 15 years ago. But truly, an unlikely guitar hero for now is John Mayer, and I know he's super uncool to like, but he's just grown into a really amazing songwriter and just an amazing guitar player. And if all you know is your body's a wonderland, I would encourage anyone listening to maybe do a little bit of a deeper dive. Look up on YouTube him just playing guitar. An amazing guitar player. I think Lizzie Hale is a pretty bitchin' guitar player who I love that she's out there doing her thing, like holding it down for the electric guitar, and she can rock. But I also wonder too if like I'm too old to know, like maybe there are some really cool guitar-based bands with some future guitar heroes that I don't even have the pulse on yet. You might know more about that than me.
Yeah, I do think there's some nice, some good young guitar players, but in terms of innovation, I don't hear the innovation. I don't hear the Eddie Van Halen that changes the game. I don't hear the Tom Morello that
I was just about to mention
style.
Tom. I think the last guy because when I think about people who change the game, Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen are like the two pillars of who changed guitar, right?
Right.
And then you can maybe put the Edge in there. Johnny Marr might fit around in there somewhere, but Tom Morello is the last guy who did things with the guitar that no one had ever done, right?
Yep.
Jack White might be up in there because he does some far out stuff with the guitar that I felt like I never heard before with whammy pedals and stuff. But Tom Morello making the guitar sound like a robot was like, I'll never forget hearing that stuff, hearing Evil Empire for the first time and hearing People of the Sun where he's playing it with this Allen wrench or the solo to Bulls on Parade with all that scratching. Just thinking it was pedals. And I remember they would even put in their liner notes, all the sounds you hear on this album were made by a guitar, no pedals, They were like proud of that at the time. I wonder what the next iteration of that will be, for sure.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And I think, the art of playing, because my son plays, but I remember my brother playing guitar, and it's just different. My brother would stay up for hours till 3 o'clock in the morning, and he'd have his headphones on because he'd be playing through the headphone, and I would walk by his room to go to the bathroom, and I could hear the strings playing. I could hear the strings. Mm-hmm. Whereas, I think I could be wrong, but there's kids today that just play for an hour or two, and then they go play video games. I just think there's more to distract kids from mastering their craft than years before.
Yeah. There's a lack of emphasis on mastering something. That's just in general too. That's with adults too. There's just so much to distract everybody. Putting in the proverbial 10,000 hours, it was just easier to do when there was less shit going on. I mean,
right.
that's absolutely the case. And it's so easy to there's so many shortcuts now with like the way you can record music, the way you can fix things, and you can beat detective a loop. You can snap everything to a grid. You don't even have to play it in time. You can auto-tune your vocal a little bit. You can pull samples of other. You don't even have to play guitar. Like I remember seeing Deadmau5's his master class on YouTube. He's a Skrillex type sort of crazy DJ guy, and he's like, I don't even know how to play music. I just press buttons, and I'm like, man, that's a shame. No one was getting away with that shit in the 70s, And again, right. I hate to dip into the get off my lawn stuff, but dude, in the 60s and 70s, in my opinion, the 70s was just the heyday of music. And you had to just really be able to do it and do it live. You had to really be able to record. There was just no hiding behind anything. So you had to put that time in to really master what you were doing. And that feels a little bit gone.
I agree. Well, we could talk for hours about the future of rock and what it means and where it's going and all the ins and outs of it. But it was a great conversation, Clint. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Once again, everybody, Clint Wells from Metal Up Your Podcast. You could find it on metalupyourpodcast.com. Great podcast, very Metallica driven, but very informative, very good discussions. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion. I know I did. Once again, I'm Jay Scott. This is the Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. We'll chat again soon. Thanks.